Good morning, everybody. Good to have all of you here. I think we got a few minutes we can talk before the next service. It's sort of busy on confirmation days here at St. Paul's. Evan and I talked back and forth this past week over what might be a good thing to do in this meeting. We've done various things in various years. We thought perhaps we would just sort of keep the focus on the Lambeth Conference this morning, since it has been in the news lately and is supposed to be happening next year. Please make this a conversation and not a lecture, okay? So ask questions and make comments. First of all, the Lambeth Conference is, as Evan said, usually a decennial meeting of the bishops of the Anglican Communion. It should have been held a year ago, if we were actually doing it every 10 years. The Archbishop of Canterbury could not get the participation he felt of enough people for 2008, and this would have been about actually 4 years ago when he was trying to work on getting the conference set up, because it takes about 3 years to get it set up. And he couldn't get participation from everybody, so he put it off, and they finally decided to do it in 2020. So the bishops get together. First of all, the Lambeth Conference does not meet at Lambeth. It meets at Canterbury. So it did meet at Lambeth originally in the 1800s. I think the first time that the bishops met in the 1870s, about 76 bishops showed up. There were 144 Anglican bishops at the time, and 76 showed up. And you can go back and you can read on Wikipedia, of all places, why the first one happened. Part of it was because the church in Canada was worried about some Privy Council decisions being made in England about what would be happening to the church in Canada. And there was also some problems with the Bishop of Natal about scandal going on in that diocese in the missionary field. So anyway, the bishops gathered together. There has been a history of putting out resolutions at Lambeth conferences in one form or another. If you can go back in the Anglican Communion website, you can find all those resolutions from the 1800s on. A lot of them are like scratch your head resolutions as to why they were saying what they did, which may actually be a reflection of what we do at General Convention in the Episcopal Church every 3 years. You scratch your head later on and say, why did we do that? You will find that as times have changed in the Anglican Communion, what the bishops have said has varied. They came out in 1930, I think, strongly against birth control. Just to let you know that it's not always been this the current way of living into the Anglican lifestyle that we would think about now. It's not always been the same. So in some ways, the Anglican Communion's bishops, as they've met at Lambeth, have reflected what's been going on in the larger culture. And that's something we always need to be aware of. The last one that we had was 2008. That was the first one that I went to. We had a little over 600 bishops who showed up for that. And there were about 250 or so who did not show up, primarily from some countries in Africa and Southeast Asia, who were mad at the Episcopal Church, to be very honest about it. So far for next year, I think in the latest news release I saw, slightly over 500 bishops have said that they will be attending. And I have no idea how many bishops have decided not to attend and how many bishops have simply not sent registrations in yet. They were asking for registrations by the end of March of this year. Yes? There are probably about 900 bishops or so right now in the Anglican Communion. I couldn't find that exact number. The question was, how many bishops are there? What percentage would that be? So we were looking at maybe 600 and some out of 800 and some at the last one. As I say, that very first one, 76 showed up out of 144. At the very first one, even the Archbishop of York in England and some of the suffragan bishops would not show up at it because they didn't think it was right to have a Lambeth conference. So it's varied through the years. Now, the interesting thing that's really taken place over the last 3 conferences or so is that spouses have been invited, and that has led to one of the problems we're having for next year's Lambeth conference, on which spouses are invited. when the spouses were invited the first time, and there are a couple of issues. One you've read about in the newspaper, and one that you haven't, which I was hearing about yesterday when I was in Memphis for a bishop's consecration. The spouses were first invited, I think, about 1968. They had never been invited before then. Of course, then it was all wives. The conference had grown at that point that it was being held in Canterbury at the University of Kent, as opposed to being held in London or somewhere. They had to have the space that was necessary, and it was there at Canterbury at the university. The spouses actually had to stay at a separate site, and because back then it was all wives. And so they had a separate location they stayed at. Then they started, at the next one, started letting the spouses stay with the bishops. Now, we were all appalled at the last Lambeth conference how bad the housing facilities were. Right? They say they've gotten better this time. So a lot of spouses chose not to stay on campus last time because the housing was so bad. It didn't have private baths and all that sort of stuff. I mean, it was a different, and no air conditioning. It was in the 90s. So anyway, this next this next meeting of the Lambeth Conference, the question is, which spouses will be invited? And of course, what's been in the news is the Archbishop has decided that he will not invite the spouses of same-sex married bishops. So there are, we have 2 of those currently in the Anglican Communion. As of June, there will be a 3rd, and we have some more elections taking place in the United States over the next 6 or 7 months where there may be a same-sex spouse also. And I don't think the Archbishop is going to change his decision on that. The problem that he currently has is how official is it going to be not to have them on the campus, because the University of Kent's leadership has said that is against what we believe is correct to do. Would you like us to pull our invitation for you to stay here? So they are working through that problem right now, and I think they're trying to find some way that spouses can be somewhere on campus but not part. So anyway, that's one of the issues about spouses. The other is there seems to be, and this is very different from the mindset of what we would have in the United States, there seems to be this belief that the spouse is sort of an integral part of the bishop. And the spouse's ministry is integral to the bishop's ministry. And you would find this happening a lot more, that mindset in Africa, than of course you find in the United States, where we say the spouse has a life of his own or her own, probably has a job of his own or her own. But there's this idea that the spouse is very much involved in the ministry of the bishop, almost as a team ministry. And so that is causing some head scratching here in the United States about the spouse issue. And the other spouse issue, which we discovered, is that the wife of the Archbishop of Canterbury said within the last couple weeks, I am Mama Canterbury, and my children are the wives of the primates across the communion, and my grandchildren are the wives of the bishops across the communion. And we just went, whoa, that's an issue, because our polity in the communion has always been, for example, that the Archbishop of Canterbury is first among equals. The Archbishop has no jurisdictional authority over other provinces of the communion. And so that seems to be a polity statement that's different from what we're used to. And we've always been pushing back for decades, at least in the American Episcopal Church, against the idea of there being a jurisdiction over the individual provinces of the Anglican Communion. So we'll see where that discussion leads over the next few months as they try to work out the details of the conference. At the last conference, there were several separate meetings of bishops and spouses. And at this conference, I am told that they're going to find more of the meetings where everybody's together and having discussions together. So where we would have had perhaps bishops sitting down at tables discussing issues, it may be bishops and spouses this time. We're not quite certain about that yet. They're still working on it. There was a hand over here somewhere. Yeah.
Thank you. So you talked about sort of the process around organizing the conference. So what are the agenda issues, or what are the issues that they need to work out?
Here is, the purpose of the conference. This is the Archbishop's letter to the bishops. He says, it is a significant moment in the history of our extraordinary family as we witness to our shared love in Jesus Christ. and seek God's direction for an Anglican communion equipped for the 21st century. The focus of study is going to be the first epistle of Peter. And he says here that there will be small group study, and I want to go into small groups in a second. We will grapple with some of the major challenges facing us as leaders in our own local context, as well as regionally and globally. More than that, we will seek in prayer a common mind on and fresh commitment to the work of evangelism, the role of the church, and patterns of life and holiness that proclaim the love and grace of Jesus. And let's see, that's basically what he's saying about what the purpose is going to be. At the last Lambeth Conference, part of the discussion was on the issue of human sexuality. How do we have a listening process? And people, or at least from the Episcopal Church, are pressing the Archbishop on, let's continue that listening process, and it's difficult to have a listening process if some of the people aren't invited to the table. So we'll see where that leads us in the future on that issue. I think the small groups, as we did them, especially at the last Lambeth Conference, were groups of sometimes 20 bishops who would get together. We had groups of 8 that would get together for like daily Bible study, or 12, and then groups of 20 to 30 bishops from all over the world that were assigned different groups to be in to discuss issues and basically just say what was on your heart about what was being discussed that day, as people tried to listen to one another. And that was relatively successful. In 1998, they started taking votes on resolutions, and that's when the communion really had a split. And so they committed at the last conference not to take votes on issues. Although the Archbishop, after the last conference ended, put out a letter saying, this is what we did. So, but we weren't all part of that. So, yes, Cameron.
So the Lambeth Conference really has no ability to dictate to the American province. So what recently happened in the Methodist Church could not happen here.
That is correct, because the Methodist Church has over 30% of its delegates from Africa and Southeast Asia. And that's part of the Methodist Church that we all know here in America would be voting at convention. Right. The only people voting at our convention include the people who are part of the dioceses of the Episcopal Church. Now, having said that, there is what I would call the moral suasion that goes on. There was a decision, for example, it's been now almost 3 years ago, that the American church would not participate in any discussions on doctrine for 3 years. I'm going to say, in my words, as punishment for for electing Gene Robinson. That 3-year time frame is up before the next Lambeth Conference. But it's like, how do you live with one another? And if you go back and you read the history of what's happened at the Lambeth Conference, there's been a much stronger emphasis on what holds us together as Anglicans would be the creeds. Of course, we had that the Chicago Lambeth Quadrilateral about the creeds and Scripture and the episcopate. We see that sort of holds us together. But how do we actually live with one another, and how much in communion do we feel that we are with one another? It's not a mandatory, adjudicatory process, but it's this sort of personal relationship and how far we'll go with one another. And that's are you in communion with a part of the church that will not be in the same room with you? That's one of the questions that we keep trying to struggle with. It's a varied group.
To what extent then is the Lambeth Conference a real instrument of unity, and to what extent does it become a chance for people to make public disagreements? Do you feel it pulling the Anglicans together?
I have always felt that it's more toward pulling Anglicans together than to make statements that would separate one group from another group. I do think that the personal relationships that develop at the conference are very important as far as keeping work going on, missionary work and work among poor folks across the world. That is greatly strengthened by what happens at the Lambeth Conference. The stories I heard from the bishops at the last conference who were living in Burma, Myanmar, on what they were dealing with. Makes you realize what a struggle Christianity can be for some people in parts of the world, and there's much more empathy and a willingness to work with those folks. Now, I will say that there are a fair number of bishops from the developing world that come to Lambeth looking for financial partners, for people who will support them financially in their ministry. So, and that's a way of, really of working with one another, finding out where the needs are. I hope that answers the question. I've not found people at the conference other than some people say that 1998 conference was really a divisive conference. But I don't think the last conference was as divisive. I do think we're at least able to listen to one another, and I thought that was important. The only legal thing that holds the communion together is the Anglican Consultative Council. And that happens to be meeting right now in Hong Kong. It meets every 3 years. And there are representatives from across the Anglican communion there. Not every diocese, not every province has representatives at it. But they have at least a charter. And we thought the amazing thing, this came out, I read about it this morning. I don't have all the latest news on it. They have a charter in England as an English not-for-profit. And Justin Welby told them about 5 days ago that they couldn't talk about his decision not to invite spouses because English law wouldn't let the group talk about doctrine, even though the group's meeting in Hong Kong. But then they apparently, in the last 24 hours, they've had some reconciliation on that one. But that's sort of the only group that has any standing. That is a primary, I think, example of the unity and how that group works together as an official body. But the bishops simply gathered together to hear stories from one another and share about mission. That's what we hope happens there. And then the primates themselves, so each individual province of the Anglican Communion, with Michael Corey being our primate, they meet on occasion as well. And I'd love to be a fly on the wall in some of those meetings. Next question. What's that? It's a rather extensive meeting. It's about 10 days or 12. Go ahead. Oh, go ahead. Yeah, okay.
Are any representatives of other faiths invited, even for a portion of it?
Great question. In fact, we had a discussion about this yesterday in Memphis. We do have a wide variety of ecumenical officers from other faith traditions that show up, and also some interfaith people who show up. So you will find representatives from Methodism, the Baptist, worldwide Baptist churches, Roman Catholics, the Orthodox churches. They are all there as observers, not necessarily as participants at table discussions. The separate Anglican bishops who broke away from the Episcopal Church and other parts of the communion are also going to be there as observers at this next meeting. So there's going to be, I think, some gentle walking on eggshells on how to handle those folks, because it's like they're going to be wanting in the tent more than outside the tent. And I say in the tent. Last time we literally met in a tent, for a meeting, but this time they've got a better gym or something at the university that we're meeting in. And the other thing that does happen there, in addition to seeing the wide variety of Anglicanism, and we just we don't understand how broad Anglicanism is. I mean, there were a couple bishops, I think, who brought both their wives to the last Lambeth conference. You get a wide variety of and you see how people's faith is lived out very differently than anything that we can associate with Anglicanism. And I think that is really important. The other thing that we do is we have an optional opportunity for those of us outside of Great Britain to go visit for 3 or 4 days with a bishop in part of Great Britain, and so Great Britain and Northern Ireland. So we have a chance to do that. We had a hand over here, I think. Somebody? Okay. Okay. I thought we did. Okay. Did you? Yeah. Okay. they, when you look at, so every bishop was invited. We have, out of those probably 900 bishops in the Anglican Communion, approximately, you would find about 140. These are all active bishops. Retired bishops aren't invited, but all active bishops are invited. So you'd find about 140 are in the Episcopal Church. So we are the largest contingent there. The reality of the deal is they set the fee to attend the conference at a high level, knowing that the American church will pay the rack rate. And that sort of supports other people showing up, because it's about a $6,000 fee to attend for one person, and it would be $12,000 for taking a spouse. Yeah, Ray.
In terms of soul count, what percent of Christendom is Anglican or Episcopal?
We've always described ourselves as being the third largest Christian group in the world, and it really depends on how you count it. Probably, I've heard 60 million, I've heard 80 million. When you get to the 80 million number or more, there are often tendencies to include anybody in England who hasn't said he's anything else. and nobody in England's going to church. And the largest part of that would be in Africa. That's where the most of the Anglican Communion is. So you would find the American church with a large number of bishops. Then you would find in Africa, amongst the various provinces in Africa, probably about 300 bishops, something like that.
So it sounds like, you describe it like in that way, it sounds like a group. But then when you talk about the workings of the conference and kind of all these different affiliations, it sounds a lot looser than that from a organizational standpoint. How do you personally reconcile like the kind of administrative workings of what you're going into versus kind of your faith?
I can leave the administrative workings of the Anglican Communion to the Anglican Consultative Council. And I think when the bishops gather, it's really a chance to sit down and talk about faith and experience. And I think that works. And let me tell you, in many ways, that's the same way the Episcopal Church works. Our dioceses are so independent in the Episcopal Church. Michael Curry has no authority over the Diocese of Arkansas. He has limited authority over the Bishop of Arkansas if somebody catches me doing something bad. But other than that, Michael Curry has no authority. So what's happening in the communion in some ways is a reflection of how our own church polity works. Now, our own church polity in the Episcopal Church does not work the same as the polity does in some other parts of the Anglican Communion. In Africa in particular, it's very much driven by the Archbishop of that province and the diocesan bishop. And you do not find nearly the amount of lay involvement in church leadership in other parts of the communion as you find in the Episcopal Church. We have a very high level of lay participation in the Episcopal Church, and the laity have to agree to what's going on. And that's not as much the case you'd find in Africa and Southeast Asia. I don't think you have a question.
In our prayers of the people, when we name the particular bishops and other ministers, we're very intentional about not naming Justin, the Archbishop of Canterbury, before naming our presiding bishop or our bishop because of that lack of specific authority. However, we do name Michael, our presiding bishop, as the prayers invite. Is that where's that balance? How do we, as we name Michael as our presiding bishop, to what extent are we invited to think of him as primate and presiding bishop, and in what way is he also first among equals?
He is primate. You will also notice, if you're looking at his title, he is not archbishop. And the Episcopal Church chose not to call him archbishop because he does not have authority over the dioceses. I will give you a personal story, and this is not about Michael, it's about Catherine Jefferts Shorey. When she came to visit Little Rock one time, and she was preaching on Sunday morning at Christ Church, I said, well, Catherine, I'll have you go in line in front of me as we go in, because I was bishop of this diocese and she wasn't. She wasn't happy. I was telling that story to the Bishop of Texas after that, and he goes, well, she wouldn't let me do that when he tried. So, Michael Curry is our presiding bishop. I think is a wonderful focus for us. As I say, he does have some authority, but the authority that the presiding bishop has over individual dioceses in the Episcopal Church is very limited. We have had the situation recently when the bishops of the Episcopal Church turned down the election of the bishop in Haiti because of lots of problems in Haiti. I mean, Haiti, as many of you know, is a failed country, and the church is a failed church there in many ways. It was a mess. But but the presiding bishop can't step in and appoint a bishop for Haiti. The presiding bishop would stand there and help them and make suggestions and help them find a provisional bishop if they wish. But that diocese, as broken as it is still able to make its own decisions. And as I say, that is something you'll find different in our church than you'd find in many parts of the Anglican Communion, where the archbishop / primate is very much in charge of what's going on, and the individual dioceses have less power. What else? Yes.
This may not be appropriate.
Okay.
I'm a very recent refugee from the Methodist Church. Could you explain the structure of the Episcopal Church
Okay.
to me? I have some vague
Okay.
idea, but
Okay. What's the structure of the Episcopal Church? The Episcopal Church these days is made up of about 99 domestic dioceses and a few dioceses in other countries, primarily being Taiwan. We have 2 dioceses in Ecuador, a diocese in Haiti, a diocese in Venezuela, a couple of other places, and a few churches in Europe. A diocese is a geographical area. In the case of Arkansas, it is Arkansas. In the case of Tennessee, where I was yesterday for a new bishop's consecration, there are 3 dioceses: East Tennessee, Tennessee, and West Tennessee. That was a geography issue for them. In the Diocese of Montana, that's all one diocese. We have a couple of dioceses that actually go across state lines. And then again, you've got places such as Texas where there are 5.5 dioceses. So the diocese is a geographic area. It is made up of congregations, and it is led by a bishop and sometimes and one or more assisting bishops. And the congregations that are parishes or however particular diocese decides to do the election process are in charge of electing a bishop. And depending on the diocesan canons, a group is in charge of a diocesan budget. And there is a group in the diocese that's made up of lay people and clergy who have to approve all ordinations. And then anytime a bishop is elected, that bishop has to be approved by a majority of the bishops with jurisdiction in other dioceses and a majority of standing committees from all those dioceses. So that's the control we have. It's a very loose control, but we have exercised that control in a negative ways as far as not approving people a few times in the last few years. Haiti was one of the examples that I gave you. We turned down a bishop who was elected in northern Michigan, that was maybe about 20 years ago or something like that, due to in part some of his comments on baptism. And we turned down the bishop in South Carolina a few years ago because he had no intention of staying in the Episcopal Church. And so that was a problem that we had. To give you Arkansas's history, and see, these things rarely happen, but in the 1930s, we had an election for bishop in Arkansas when the candidate who was going to win by the standards of the day was a racial progressive. A second person came in, and I can tell you, I'm going to tell you, there's no secret. It was the rector of Christ Church in Little Rock, At the last minute, a second candidate came in who was not so progressive, and it was the dean at the cathedral. The election was held in Newport, and we had a few members, African American members of the clergy in those days. I mean, a lot more than we've got now. And they wouldn't let the African American members of the clergy participate in the communion service at the electing convention. They could vote, but they couldn't participate in communion service. The dean at the cathedral, the non-progressive, was elected. And the African Americans got so mad that they convinced the Episcopal Church not to give consent to his election. And if you want to know why Christ Church and the cathedral have hated each other ever since, that's why.
But in terms of our structure, all of those dioceses, domestic and Honduras and the foreign dioceses, we all have the same prayer book, though not necessarily in the same language, the same canons that govern the church, the same presiding bishop. So in the Episcopal churches in Honduras today, they're also praying for Michael, our presiding bishop. But the other provinces like England or Scotland or elsewhere, they'd have a different prayer book, different leaders, different rules, which is why, unlike the Methodist Church, it gets so messy because we don't have rules to tell us how we're supposed to relate with one another. Well, that's kind of an oversimplification, but yes.
I would say, throughout the history of the Anglican Communion is something that nobody expected to happen. It wasn't planned for. It was, in large part, it came about because after America won the Revolutionary War, we weren't going to have English bishops in America. So we had to figure out a new way to relate to one another. And so the Anglican Communion, in a sense, sort of developed after that by happenstance, and where the missionary activities were taking place around the world through England. And it was then in the 1800s, as more bishops get out there in the world, they started trying to figure out how do we get together and talk with one another. And I'd have to say, in some ways, it was a gentleman's agreement, and I will use the word gentleman very deliberately. It was a gentleman's agreement on how to relate with one another, to relate to one another. And it's gotten more formal through the years. Is that it? I've got to get dressed, yeah. Thank you all very much. I appreciate it greatly. If you ever have any questions anytime, you can always email. I'll answer. Thank you.